begin.
Thanks everyone for showing up on Friday afternoon. It's the first of a double header, and the speaker is Jerry Mock, who most of you know as a former undergraduate who finished up last spring, in May, and then jumped right into a master's degree. So he was actually able to hit the ground running in terms of data collection. In the summer, he visited Guatemala not once, but twice, collected some really phenomenal digital imagery of a target area that he's going to talk about. So I don't want to give away all the secrets, but he was able to collect a great data set even before beginning his master's program. So you all know that the thesis proposal defense is second semester, and this particular project requires analysis of the data he's already collected, but he's already planning to head back to Guatemala in August of the next year because of some of the tantalizing results he's going to share with us. So thanks, Jerry.
All right. Okay, thanks, Jeff. All right, so today I'm going to be telling you about my proposed research concerning Lahar morphological change along the Las Lajas drainage over the 2021 rainy season with differencing of high-resolution digital elevation models. So you can see the picture in the background is actually the Las Lajas drainage. So Lahars are responsible for 26% of the volcano-related deaths since they started recording in 1500 AD. The deadliest Lahar in recent history was in the city of Armero in Colombia in 1985, where 28,000 people lost their lives. With this study, I hope to better understand the behavior of Lahars. So to orient everyone, you see in this inset map here, Guatemala is located in Central America and shares a border with Mexico. And the red triangle here is the location of Fuego Volcano. So our region of interest, or ROI, is located about 5 kilometers from the summit of Fuego Volcano and is split into 5 roughly equal overlapping sections. This part of the channel was chosen because it coincides with the target field area of Ashley Bosa's project, and because it regularly experiences lahars that can be monitored by time-lapse cameras and infrasound sensors. The Las Lajas drainage had 22 recorded lahars last year, according to Ashley's data and reports from INSVUME, which is the Instituto Nacional de Seismología, Volcanología, Meteorología y Hidrología, which is the Guatemalan equivalent to the USGS with a way more complicated name. So this area is also important because according to the Smithsonian Global Volcanism Program, there are over 50,000 people living within 10 kilometers of Fuego's vent, and lahars can reach far beyond that radius. So what is a lahar exactly? A lahar is a slurry of mud and debris, similar to a debris flow, except that they happen on the flanks of a volcano. As you can see in this figure from Bosa et al. 2021, the leading edge has a watery front, followed by a bouldery snout, and then a watery tail. Lahars occur in pulses and can transport an incredible amount of material, as you'll see later on. They can quickly change the morphology of an area through erosion or deposition. So you may be curious where all the material for the lahars is coming from. Fuego Volcano is one of the most active volcanoes in Central America. It has had frequent eruptions since the onset of the Spanish era in 1524, when detailed records of the activity began. It occasionally goes into short periods of dormancy. However, the current active phase has been going on since 1999. It is characterized by a nearly constant Strombolian style eruption every 15 to 20 minutes, like the one that's pictured. The less frequent, larger eruptions often produce lava flows, explosions, ashfall, and far-reaching pyroclastic density currents, or PDCs, with a VEI, or volcanic explosivity index, of around 2. Although there have been historical eruptions with a VEI of up to 4 on the logarithmic scale. Most recent large eruption was last month with a VEI of 2, which had multiple PDCs. The Las Lajas drainage was filled by a PDC in June of 2018. That PDC also destroyed the village of San Miguel Las Lotes, killing between 400 and 1,000 people. So, change detection through the differencing of digital elevation models is a well-accepted method and has been used to great success in many areas. These examples used unoccupied aerial vehicles, or UAVs. I actually brought one with me today that you can see right there. They use these to collect their data, everything from river studies to post-fire erosion studies to tracking the changes in cone shape at Stromboli volcano. This technique is established and useful for detecting change and making accurate volume estimates. So I used a DJI Mavic Air 2 UAV and the Drone Link flight planning software to collect the photogrammetry data. There were on average 260 photos taken per flight to achieve the 80% overlap at 100 meters above the takeoff point. While effective in flat areas, one downside of the software is the lack of terrain tracking. So we were not able to follow the slope of the channel, and we're at a fixed altitude above the takeoff point. This made data acquisition increasingly difficult as the slope got more extreme, but regardless, the flights were repeated at roughly monthly intervals from late May to early October, which represents the rainy season in Guatemala when Lahar activity is highest. So here we have a data table detailing the data collected. The columns are the monthly surveys, and the rows are the sections of the ROI. You can see over here, each is labeled by the flight date, type of flight, and the number of pictures taken. The data I'm presenting today is highlighted in yellow. And on the bottom picture here, you can see Armando Pineda preparing to execute one of the Drone Link flight plans. Armando is one of our Guatemalan collaborators and completed several of the planned flights for me while I wasn't in country. So to process the data, I uploaded it into Agisoft Metashape Pro and used this workflow, which is adapted from the USGS guidelines and advice from Thomas Vanderweyde. For each survey, it takes about 6 hours from start to finish. For the sake of time, I'll just highlight the most important parts. So since we were unable to collect ground control points while we were there, I created synthetic ground control points, or SGCPs, with static features by comparing the orthomosaics from the first and last surveys in a section. Agisoft recommends 10 GCPs evenly spread throughout the ROI for the best results. You can see I chose 12 in this section for redundancy. So after importing the pictures, they're aligned and optimized. The markers, which are the SGCPs, are then manually aligned. Then the dense point cloud is generated and cleaned up. After that, the DEM and orthomosaic are generated and then can be exported. A report can also be generated, which is going to be how I'm going to account for the error in my final project. So the DMs for each survey will be created and exported at 10 centimeters per pixel resolution for consistency across the sections. Since the DEMs are the same size and set relative to each other by the SGCPs, I can subtract one from the other to find the change over time in the DOD. So this DOD is the October DEM minus the June DEM in section 4. The warm colors indicate erosion, and the cooler colors represent deposition or plant growth. I included this orthomosaic so you can compare the green with the purple. You can see most of the purple outside the drainage is due to foliage. As you can see, this is a very dynamic landscape with erosion over 20 meters in places. Here you can see I've taken some cross sections along the channel facing upstream. By the 10-meter axis ticks, you can see that in sections A and B, the channel is eroded down and to the right by several meters, while C and D have a mixture of erosion and deposition happening. Overall, we can conclude that this is an erosion-dominated landscape upstream up here and transitioning to deposition downstream. So in order to get a more accurate volume measurement, I masked off the area outside the channel, which contained all the vegetation growth. As you can see, the volume difference before and after are drastic. Before masking the vegetation, the volume is almost 40,000 cubic meters in the positive, and after is 110,000 cubic meters in the negative. For perspective, that's approximately 2,500 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of material eroded from the channel over one rainy season. So moving forward, I expect to process all the remaining data and produce figures, much like the ones earlier in this presentation. I plan to produce a DOD for each time step from survey 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and 3 to 4, then for the entire season, with erosion and deposition volumes for each. Next, I'm going to compare the volumes with rain data and Lahar size and frequency to find any correlations there. I plan to write a paper and submit it to a peer-reviewed journal by the end of the fall semester and present my work at a professional conference. Ashley Bosa and I will be returning to Guatemala for a few weeks in August to do some more field work. I plan to repeat this process on a more active channel at a tighter temporal resolution to bracket the individual Lahars with a better sensor. Then I'll write another paper, hopefully, from what I find from that data, and I hope to complete my master's and defend in the fall of 2023. So I would like to thank my committee, Jeff Johnson, Jen Pierce, and Megan Cattell, the lead student researcher on the Lahar project, Ashley Bosa, my patient and helpful technical support, James Nelson, Thomas Vanderweide, and Josh Anderkine, our Michigan Tech collaborators, Greg Waite, Gustavo Bejar Lopez, and Rudiger Escobar Wolf, our Guatemalan collaborators, Armando Pineda and Amilcar Roca, and finally, my friends and family. Here are my references. And are there any questions? Yes. So Ashley asked what I expect to see when I finally get to compare my volume data and the rain data and the frequency data, the Lahar frequency data. So I expect that there's going to be a strong correlation once the initial, so it's going to start very high for the volumes that move when the rain starts, because there's all summer worth of material that's collected at the top, and just as soon as it starts raining, it's all going to come down. And then I expect it to even out and show a tighter correlation through the rest of the season, because it'll be an equivalent amount of volume moving throughout. Yes, follow-up question. Okay, Ashley is asking if the distribution of rain throughout the channel is equivalent and if I'll see that, right? Okay, so I think that we're gonna see a lot more rain in the upper reaches closer to the top of the volcano, just as a guess from what I've discussed with Gustavo in the past. I think we're gonna see, yeah, I think we're gonna see that correlation in the data when we do our comparisons. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So this data set is only across just a few months. So it's only just one rainy season, and I can say that I'm fairly confident that the SGCPs that I've chosen are static between the beginning of the season and the end. When I chose them, I chose like the corner of this rock that didn't move on both of those, both the beginning and the end. So I can say with some degree of confidence that it didn't move more than a couple of centimeters during that entire time. And it's also redundant across 12 of those. So we've got some backup there. Yes. Okay, so for the Zoom people, what do I think will be relevant to the local populace in my findings? So I think that I'll be able to present my findings to Insivume I think I'll be able to present the relationship between the rain data and the Lahar intensity and the reach specifically between that relationship. I think that's going to be the most meaningful result from this. So I'll be able to say that Lahars of this size in this part of the season correlate with rain intensity of this size. And I think that'll be very helpful for their predictive models. Yes, Matt. Okay, so I think you're asking, is there a sense of what the behavior of the Lahars are locally? Yes, so that information is definitely common knowledge among the local people, and they actually have observers that live along these Lahar paths that report to Insivume to give, like, there's a Lahar happening right now, and then Insivume reports it to the broader populace. So there are a lot of knowledgeable people who know what's happening. It's just a matter of being able to get the hard data to link that to those reports. Yes. Yes. So to recap that question. So will my information inform the model, and what does that model look like? Yeah. Okay, so as far as I know, the model that Insivume has is less robust. Like I'm not sure that they have like a working like computer model, right? So this would be adding the vital information that they need to maybe start building something that can be more predictive than reactive. So when there's a large Lahar that gets reported by one of the citizen observers, they just let people know downstream that there's a large Lahar without really knowing where the extent of that Lahar is going to end up. But they usually stick within these Lahar channels. But there are roads that cross these Lahar channels, not on bridges. They just cross the channel. So there is a definite hazard there consistently during the Lahar season. Yes. So Scott is asking if the usefulness of the model, since it's in such a dynamic landscape, would need calibrating over a season. So what I'm doing with this is I don't think it'll really need calibrating per se, because I'm looking at it as it's changing. Like that's built into what I'm doing. So the erosion that's happening, like that is the data. So it wouldn't really be necessary to calibrate around it, because that's actually what I'm looking at. So. Yes. This one? I don't know yet. I know that Sinisa is the name of the other channel. I know that it's a lot flatter than Las Lajas, but I don't know how the erosional and depositional regimes are going to change. And that's part of why we're going to that other channel, to see if these relationships still hold. Oh yeah, there's also a lot more material upstream that gets added to the system. So it's a very, very active system. Okay, all right. No, Jen said it's a lot of erosion. Where's the deposition primarily occurring? Downstream. That's where it's all coming in.
Hey Jerry, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great job, really wonderful presentation, and obviously really relevant work. Yeah, so the reason I asked that is that one helpful thing you might be able to do is to compare your eroded and deposited volumes, even kind of coarsely, to see where that deposition, how well the recorded deposition matches your estimates of erosion. And then those can be used to feed into some other estimates from other studies of frequency and magnitude of these types of events. So those would be my suggestions there. But yeah, so I guess the erosion is happening downstream. Do you have any intention or mechanisms to try to, the deposition is occurring downstream, and do you have any way to try to measure that?
Yes, that's actually going to be part of my findings from the DODs. I can just separate everything that's negative and positive and get depositional volumes and erosional volumes from those same figures. And that's actually going to be part of my major findings. Like that's where that relationship changes throughout the rainy season is going to be part of the major things that I'm looking at, because I expect it to, I expect that line to move throughout the rainy season and give us some sort of indication where, like how powerful these lahars are and what we can expect to see given this much rain in this part of the season.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. And I know Megan has her hand up too. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Wonderful job, Jerry. I particularly appreciated how much detail you included about your UAS flight parameterization and processing parameterization. That's something that's missing from a lot of these types of presentations. So I appreciated that. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, you talked about correlating rainfall and how much material is being displaced. And just in terms of thinking about how generalizable your results are, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to what other factors you think might be influencing those processes.
What other factors could be influencing these processes? Well, the rainfall is definitely a key part of it, but the amount of material that's being added to the system by the volcano is also major. Like the the amount of, I would say that that's the biggest secondary thing apart from the rain, like the amount of material that's there and the slope, obviously. Like the slope on the volcano, like in this area is going to be different from another area, and that's going to have a really large impact on the power of the lahar as it comes down. Did that answer your question? Excellent. All right. I'm going to close out of here and hand everything over to Angela.
And Jerry, just one final comment, because you brought it up. I would love to see the longitudinal profile of your channel to investigate that slope transition, because I think you're in an interesting point on the landscape in terms of that inflection point between erosion and deposition. So
yes, that's part of the plan.
Awesome, great job.
Thanks. Okay, so how do you want to do that? Oh, there you go. Okay.
Can everybody on Zoom hear me okay? Let's see if we can. Oh. To do the push thing. Yeah. Thank you, Jerry. Good job. All right. Okay. I'm not sure how to see the Zoom chat. Yeah, no worries. Just Over here.
Oh, no,
Oh, yeah, I can't find the bar.
the Zoom bar.
The Zoom bar. Hmm.
The Zoom bar
Maybe
disappeared.
if you wait, can I see it?
Slideshow. Oh, there you go. Okay, so we want to move this over to that screen. Oops.
Let's see. All right, thanks. All right. Sorry, just see up here. Okay. I'm just gonna begin. Thank you everybody for coming to my master's thesis proposal. My name is Angela Seibert. And before I begin, I'd like to thank my advisor, Dr. Nancy Glenn, and my committee members, Dr. Anna Bergstrom and Dr. Jeffrey Warren. This project is part of a larger project known as SPRUCE, which stands for Spruce and Peatland Responses Under Changing Environments. And it's funded by the Oak Ridge National Lab and the US Department of Energy. Oh, is it not shared? Wait, what do you mean? On Zoom? Oh. Let's see. Let's see the mouse. Oh. I think it's that one. Going down in the corner. Okay. Okay. Thanks for coming to my master's thesis proposal. Thank you to my advisor, Dr. Nancy Glenn, and Dr. Anna Bergstrom, and Dr. Jeffrey Warren. Like I said, this project is funded by the US Department of Energy and the Oak Ridge National Lab. And I'd also like to thank the Geoscience Department as a whole and my friends and family. So in this presentation, I'll begin by introducing terrestrial LiDAR, peatlands, and the spruce site, as well as the title of the proposal, I'm sorry. So in this presentation today, I'll be talking about how we're evaluating conifer structure in a boreal peatland using an active remote sensing technique, terrestrial LiDAR. And in this presentation today, first, I will introduce peatlands, the spruce study site, as well as terrestrial LiDAR, and the two different conifer structure concepts that we're looking at. So that is leaf area index and interspecific trait variation. So first, an introduction to peatlands. Peatlands are present on every continent across the globe. They cover around 4 million square kilometers of land, which is only about 3% of the Earth's total land surface. You can see where peatlands are present in that map in green. So there are two types of peatlands. There are fens and bogs, and today I will only be talking about bogs, and I will interchangeably refer to peatlands as bogs. And so bogs form under highly acidic, anoxic, or extremely low oxygen and low nutrient conditions. So as vegetation substrate accumulates in this environment, it builds over the course of thousands of years and generates what we know as peat. And so this peat, under these highly acidic, low oxygen conditions, accumulates a huge amount of organic carbon because the rate of microbial decomposition is much lower than the rate of accumulation of this partially decomposed vegetation substrate. And this leads to the accumulation, the stabilization of organic carbon. And here you can see on the left is a mineral soil wetland. And so compared to mineral soil wetlands, peatlands hold much more stable carbon. And within the peatland, there is a layer of rising and falling sphagnum on the surface, as well as various vascular vegetation like conifer trees. So with all these components, peatlands hold around 44% of the world's global soil carbon, which is 600 gigatons. And so how much is a gigaton? A gigaton is 1 billion tons or 400,000 Olympic swimming pools. And so with this in mind, relative to the amount of land they cover and the amount of carbon that they store, peatlands hold twice as much carbon as all the world's forests. So two dominant conifer species in this ecosystem are the black spruce tree and the eastern larch tree, or the tamarack. And so the black spruce tree is an evergreen conifer, which is highly sensitive to changes in the water table within the bog. So as the water table warms or gets lower and dries out, the black spruce tends to not be found in those areas of the bog. The larch tree, on the other hand, is a deciduous conifer, and it is highly sensitive to canopy closure within the bog. So as it's shaded out, as other trees like the black spruce outgrow it, it responds by rapidly forming needles and branches and stems or trunks. So as a whole, 16% of the world's peatlands are degraded, and that happens through draining them, and in response, they dry out. So they're degraded for purposes such as agriculture, and they're also drying out in response to climate change. And so as they dry out, they become more prone to frequent fires that you can see in that figure, as well as increased greenhouse gas emissions through large amounts of carbon dioxide and methane. In fact, so these damaged peatlands only make up around 0.3% of the Earth's land, so not very much, but they account for 5% of all anthropogenic caused global carbon emissions, which is huge. That's 1.5 gigatons or 600,000 of those pools. And it's estimated that restoring all the world's damaged peatlands would mitigate the European Union's current carbon emissions. And so with this drying out in response to climate change, they're estimated to release 860 million tons of carbon dioxide every year. With this damage, and as they drain, the canopy and the conifers within the ecosystem are affected. And you can see from this figure that as the canopy is reduced, the surface of the bog is exposed to more sunlight, which increases the rate at which that water table becomes shallower and the rate at which it warms. So that microbial decomposition rate increases, making that once stable carbon now labile carbon. And so that increases greenhouse gas emissions through carbon dioxide and methane emissions. You can also see that the surface of the peatland flattens with that lowering water table, which also changes how the bog functions as a carbon sink, and we shift to them becoming a carbon source. And so the monitoring the canopy and how it responds to climate change is extremely important. So one metric that we can use to look at this is known as leaf area index, or LAI. And this is a unitless measurement. And it's defined as the projected area of foliage of your vegetation of interest divided by the ground surface area that it covers. And it is directly correlated with rates of evapotranspiration within the ecosystem and the photosynthetic rate. So we need to know what is happening with the LAI. And here in this figure, you can see that as the canopy dissipates, the rate of evapotranspiration clearly goes down because that transpiration rate is basically negligible without any leaves or needles. And then you can see as the canopy is regained, we regain ET as well. So another way that we can look at how these specific tree species differ in their responses to climate change is through a concept called interspecific trait variation. And so that's defined as differences in functional traits between the two species. And by a functional trait, I just mean a trait that impacts the development of the species. So for example, changes in height is a functional trait. And so I am looking at if the larch tree, for example, increases in height more rapidly than the black spruce tree. And so all of this work is taking place, sorry, you can't really see that, at the spruce study site in northern Minnesota. This is Minnesota. And here you can see the spruce site. It's divided into these large 12-meter diameter chambers. And within each of these chambers, the bog is under elevated carbon dioxide conditions and elevated temperature conditions. And so here are the different temperature treatments that we're using. We have a duplicate of these temperature treatments. So one set of these treatments is under elevated carbon dioxide levels, and the other set of these treatments is not under elevated carbon dioxide levels. So the spruce site is using a larger ecosystem model taken from the Department of Energy's Energy Exascale Earth System model, which is a global model to simulate how climate change is impacting different ecosystems. And so the spruce site is using the land component of that model to simulate exactly how this specific bog is responding to elevated carbon dioxide conditions and elevated temperature conditions. And so I'm not going to go into depth about how this model is working because I'm not directly working with it, but I do want to direct your attention to this specific input parameter, leaf area index. So the knowledge gap driving this project is that there is no leaf area index estimate for conifers within these chambers. And that's due to their spatial heterogeneity and the inability to use traditional leaf area index measurements to find those measurements. Let me know if you have questions about that. And so, but those traditional LAI measurements require a closed canopy or they require cutting down the trees, and we can't do that inside the chambers. So the response to that knowledge gap is the use of terrestrial LiDAR or TLS, which is an active remote sensing technique that is non-destructive and can collect a large amount of spatial data. And that works by emitting a laser pulse into your area of interest and getting a return laser pulse that provides X, Y, and Z coordinates. So you can develop a three-dimensional image called a point cloud, which I showed you at the beginning of this presentation. And this provides us with a large amount of consistent data. So the experimental question for the leaf area index portion of this project is how accurate is TLS for estimating the leaf area index of these conifer species? So the first objective of this part is to provide accurate leaf area index measurements of the two tree species and to develop an open source LAI calculation method applicable to other peatland ecosystems. And here's an example of inside a chamber. My hypothesis for this part of the project is that TLS techniques will provide accurate LAI estimates up to 90% as compared to ground truth estimates at the individual tree scale, the tree stand scale, as well as the bog scale. And then I have this figure here just so you can see how accurate TLS is at estimating the height of trees within the spruce site, as indicated by this high R² value. So how am I actually going to be finding the leaf area index of these trees? Spruce researchers started outside the chamber plots by scanning a set of spruce and larch trees and then proceeding to destructively harvest them and cut them down and take some ground truth measurements. And then with these ground truth measurements that they take, I was able to calculate the ground truth LAI of 8 different trees. And using these LAI estimates along with structural elements that we can get from the original TLS scans that they took, I was able to train and test a preliminary multivariate regression model to see what structural predictor is the best predictor of leaf area index. And then with that model, we can use structural traits that we obtain inside the chambers to apply to that model and then get the LAI predictions for each chamber. And so these trees outside of the chamber were selected based on a normal distribution of their sizes that you can see here. The larch is in blue and the spruce is in orange. We have 8 trees total, 4 of each right now. And here is how I found that ground truth LAI. And here's an animation showing exactly where these trees are found outside of the chambers. Here are 2 of them. The colors are indicative of like elevation, red being the higher elevation. And then within the plots, the spruce site along with BCal has been taking scans twice a year in the spring and the summer since 2015 of the plots. And so we have 10 chambered plots and 2 ambient plots that are under just current environmental conditions. And here you can see that this works by placing the instrument around the perimeter of the plot. And we take a scan at each of these red dots, and that's called a scan position. And after taking all of these scans, we stitch them together to form a point cloud. And here is an example of that point cloud that we can get. The colors are indicative of elevation. And so now I'll just go over some of the different structural traits that I'm getting using TLS. So one of those traits is height, and we find that by determining the tallest point of the tree and subtracting the elevation of the bog. The other traits we get are vegetation volume, canopy cover, which is a measure of the density of the canopy as well as the width, and diameter at breast height, or the circumference of the tree. And one processing method specifically that I intend to use in this project is using a reflectance difference between the vegetation and the wood of the tree to separate them apart and get estimates of branching architecture like DBH. Another method for estimating things like canopy cover and vegetation volume is a convex hull, which is where you wrap the point cloud of the tree in a polygon and get an estimate of the amount of points that make up that tree. You can also find canopy cover, or the density of the canopy, using this method. Another way that you can find aspects of canopy cover, such as the width, is by taking the top of the point cloud of the tree and rasterizing it, or creating a 2D version of the tree and calculating that width. An additional technique for finding vegetation volume that I'm using is voxelization, and that's where you convert those points into cubes called volumetric pixels, and you can change the sizes of those cubes to get different estimates of how much vegetation makes up your tree. And here you can see a larger voxel size versus a smaller one. So the preliminary results that I have for the leaf area index estimates are the following. So I found the ground truth LAIs of all 8 trees that we have so far. And you can see that the LAI estimates are skewed to the right, having lower LAI values, which is what we would expect because we're in a boreal ecosystem. Again, you can see that distribution a little more clearly right here. I also separated out these ground truth distributions by species. And interestingly, you can see that the larch has a more bimodal distribution of LAI, having extremely low LAI values and higher LAI values, while the spruce is more normally distributed. You can also see that distribution more clearly in this plot. And then I've been looking at the different predictors of LAI and how well they do. So here you can see that height is a good predictor of leaf area index, as indicated by the R² value. I also want to point out that as height increases, so does the LAI of these trees. And then I separated it out by species, and interestingly, height is an excellent predictor of LAI in the larch tree. DBH, or the diameter at breast height of the tree, on the other hand, is not as good of a predictor of LAI. And so even though it wasn't, I used it as a preliminary method of training this model to predict LAI. So I used 50% of my data for training and 50% for testing, but in the future that will change to 70% for training and 30% for testing. And so here you can see that the model needs some work. This is the actual LAI, and then we have the predicted LAI by the model. However, I got this equation after normalizing the height and the DBH as predictor variables. And I want to point out that this is the coefficient for the height in this model, and you can see that it has more influence on predicting LAI. So in the future, I'll be completing the canopy cover estimates and the volume calculations, as well as harvesting 8 more trees with the spruce group in August, and then trying some new, more direct methods of estimating leaf area index using LiDAR, as well as incorporating individual branch LAIs to build a more robust model. And I'm sorry, we're getting into the next question now. So there's another part, but so the next concept that I'm going to go into is interspecific trait variation. And the question here is just to what degree are these conifers responding differently to different environmental conditions? And the objectives of this part of the study is to monitor exactly how the spruce and larch trees are responding to the ambient conditions versus the treatment conditions that we have, and to determine what of these responses, such as height or canopy cover, are responding more rapidly to carbon dioxide or elevated temperature. And my hypothesis here is that there will be a significant difference between the branching architecture and the canopy cover of these trees. And I think this because the large tree, being a shade intolerant tree and a deciduous tree, has the tendency to accumulate needles rapidly, as well as changing its branching angles in order to maximize the amount of sunlight it gets. So I think under stressful conditions, it will rapidly change its angles more rapidly than the spruce tree, for example. And this has implications on how we understand the functionality of the bog as a carbon sink, as I said before. And how I will actually be determining the differences in these trait responses is through the same structural metric collection over time that I was talking about for the LAI part of the study, as well as the use of something called quantitative structural modeling, which is where you fit cylinders to your tree to get information, and you can get accurate information about the branching architecture of your trees, such as DBH, and then path fraction is just the length of the branches and how they change in response to stressful environmental conditions, as well as the total surface area of the tree and those branching angles that I was talking about. And that will tell us a little bit about how the tree is allocating resources differently under stressful conditions. And then you can see in this figure examples of quantitative structural models. And so after collecting all this trait information, I'll be applying it to a mixed effects model. And I intend to use varying slopes and intercepts in this model to account for the fact that each of these species will have different baseline responses to the treatments that you see here. And here's an example of a varying slope and intercept mixed effects model. And here are my expected results for this part of the study. So I expect the canopy cover and the branching architecture to be significantly different. After using this model, it will provide me with information about the mean distribution of the slopes and the intercepts of all of these trait responses overall between both the species. And then I can discern how much individual species deviate from that mean. And from this figure, you can see how much each of these different types of land cover deviates from the mean for any kind of response variable that you might have, such as height or canopy width. And the implications of this study is to understand the resilience of an essential carbon sink, and to add to the body of research that supports peatland restoration and preservation. And here are some alternatives if anybody's interested in those. And adding to the growing body of TLS algorithms, because TLS is becoming more accessible. And less expensive. My references, and thank you again, everybody. Check Zoom. Mitch. So for the Zoom people, Mitch asked if there is a proximity that you have to be, how close you have to be to the tree to get an estimation of the LAI. So terrestrial LiDAR has a sub-centimeter resolution. And you can see from this figure, but you can see from the figure, never mind. Do you remember the figure with the red dots surrounding the perimeter of the plot? So we are very close to the trees already. And we try to get a symmetric scan of the plot so that that's not an issue. And since TLS has such a fine spatial resolution, you can be probably within a yard, like you can be, as long as you have a clear coverage of data, you're okay. But I would say if you're only taking one scan, you should probably be within at least 50 yards of the tree to get an estimate of that. Yeah. Hang on, can you repeat that? Yeah. The large tree. Yeah, so the interesting part of that bimodal distribution is just that, so as I was saying, the larch has the tendency, as a deciduous tree and a shade intolerant tree, it rapidly forms needles and branches. And so as it grows, it's kind of showing that with size, it is increasing the amount of needles it has compared to the spruce over time. So you're seeing it more on the maximum side of the LAI. Sorry, I forgot to repeat the question, but Hannah was asking if there was a reasoning behind the extreme differences in height and LAI between the trees. Yeah. Yes. Thank you, everyone, for sticking around. Yes, yeah. Yeah, so the question is just asking me to talk about the seasonality of leaf area index. Leaf area index is related to the phenology of the tree and how it's affected by the seasons. And so leaf area index is at its maximum every summer. So when we are taking these measurements. So I do think that there would be a seasonal change in the leaf area index that we might not be seeing. There's tons of snow on the ground in the winter when leaf area index is at its lowest, and we don't scan at that time. because the bog is covered usually in snow, and so is that perimeter. But they do have measurements of basal area that happen in January. So there might be a way to incorporate that. We also have tons of UAV imagery of these plots too. So maybe we can incorporate that. But that's a really good question when incorporating these LAI values into the model, like the larger spruce model. I don't know if that's a good answer. Okay. Anna. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so for the Zoom folks, Anna asked me if I think that the terrestrial LiDAR data, since we have so much more of it, is it more accurate at estimating LAI than just these 8 trees? So that brings me to what my committee member, Dr. Jeffrey Warren, was actually talking to me about. So really, these methods are going to be changed, but I didn't have time to change this presentation. But essentially, moving forward, I'm going to be more directly looking at LAI using TLS. First, I'm going to do all this training to see how much, how the structural traits relate to LAI. And then I'm going to proceed to use, just directly estimate LAI with that TLS data by taking cross sections and also using a voxelization technique. And then actually taking those measurements to train another model with more robust data. Because so with these ground-based trees outside of the chambers, we're seeing inside of the chambers that these trees are actually losing their needles really rapidly and their structures changing. So those structural relationships actually won't hold outside of the chamber. So we had to find new ones inside the chamber. So that's why I need to directly find LAI inside the chamber. But yeah, I'm still working on that. But it basically uses a cross-section technique, taking the volume and then finding the probability that light will enter that canopy and hit foliage. Yeah, thanks for that question. Anna? Anna is asking how LAI is incorporated to other models. And how my findings in this project will be applied to future models. Is that right? Or current models that are under use. So LAI, when you have vegetation in the ecosystem, you need to accurately simulate how it's responding to different types of disturbances. Different researchers have found that you need LAI to accurately represent the photosynthetic rate and the evapotranspiration rate within the bog. And so they have found that it's directly correlated to changes in the soil and changes in the hydrological components too within this bog. And so they've applied this model to ecosystems such as a rainforest ecosystem with deciduous trees where they found LAI using TLS, and then looked at how fire impacts that model. And so I think that me developing this model for estimating LAI will be applicable to other peatland ecosystems as they are also disturbed, as indicated just by the use of LAI in other models. Does that answer the question? Come on. Thanks. Right, I've thought about that. So Aman asked if I have thought about incorporating the NDVI and I'm sorry, I just forgot what the other. Oh, airborne LiDAR. And if I've thought about using airborne LiDAR, or why we aren't using airborne LiDAR. And my answer to that. So TLS has a much finer spatial resolution, so we can actually look at the needles of the tree, whereas up in the air in an airplane, using airborne LiDAR, you get a more coarser resolution and you get kind of just the tops of the trees. And we need to see a more detailed view of the lower parts of the trees so that we can get information about the branching structure, because that tells us about LAI. And then I actually mentioned using NDVI, but Nancy told me that it's actually not a good proxy for estimating LAI at fine scales like that, if that answers the question. Okay. Yes. I want to say yes. It's a really large study. There are a lot of institutes working on it. We're having an all hands meeting, so I'll get updated on all the research that they are currently doing, but I can't for sure tell you right now. Thanks for staying after, everybody. I know it's 10 minutes after. Sorry about that. Look at, okay, cool.
Hey, Angela, I don't know if you can hear me.
Oh, sorry, Jen.
Oh, no worries. Great job. I was just curious also about using NDVI mainly just for like greenness and telling whether the needles were doing well. But I'll ask you about that next week.
Okay, Jen, I'm sorry, I
so
can't
great
hear
job,
you.
both of you. No worries. Bye.
The answers to those questions, I felt like I was a politician or something.